Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good whatever time of day it is, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the third in the summer 2026 Digital Classicist London seminar series. We're broadcasting live from London, despite the climate chaos we're currently experiencing, with a slightly smaller number of people in the room, a slightly larger number of people online than usual. If you are watching live on YouTube, feel free to use the chat to the right-hand side of the video to say hi, but also to ask questions, or if anything comes up either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation, and we will see those questions, and we can put them up on the screen, and we can address them, and Federico will answer any questions that we have either online or in the room. If you're watching later, because this video will remain on YouTube, obviously the live chat isn't available for you to ask questions, but I guess please feel free to get in touch. I imagine Federico is always happy to hear from people who are interested in this work. So we can still have those conversations. So I think I don't need to say anything else by way of introduction, just that we're extremely pleased and extremely excited that Federico di Pasqua from the University of Zurich is going to talk to us about some of the work he's been doing under the title of GraphRAG and the Ancient World towards a spatial AI research platform. And I'll hand over to you, Federico.
Oh. Thank you all for braving the heat wave and being here. I am pleased to present today. The main question that I'm tackling with my research is, how do we search across scattered evidence? This is something that most of you might be familiar with in our domain. We have to look at corpora that might belong to different languages and different times. And in a way, the question would be, can we leverage AI systems to yield satisfactory and helpful results when looking at such scattered evidence? My talk will consist of two sections. In the first one, I will detail the main retrieval mechanisms and that we as a field are exposed to and what their strengths and weaknesses are. In the second half, I will talk about my own system and the architectural choices I made. Now, I would like to start with something that probably most of you have encountered in your work. Months ago, I was preparing for a conference, and I was looking for a passage concerning a remarkable phenomenon associated with the Nile. As many of us, I looked at an AI model, one of the best large language models that are currently available. And I typed in this question to brainstorm ideas, have some starting points to begin my research work. This is what I got, the output that the model yielded. The water of the Nile arrives from above, and it appears to be theonti chrema, something divine, presenting itself at the same hour of every year. Now, this is a real oration by Ilias Aristides. The dates are accurate. The Greek is absolutely perfect. A scholar would cite this. However, this passage does not exist. Every word in it is invented. It does what large language models do. They argue, they confabulate convincingly. Now, the problem, and we don't know, we are not able to inspect. It's a black box that we're not able to inspect, and we are not able to know how the output has come about. This is especially important for us ancient scholars, because low resource languages such as ancient Greek and Latin tend to hallucinate the most. So grounding is essential for our field. Now, when confronted with an issue like this, I understand that the understandable, sort of very comprehensible response would be to become Luddite and get rid of these tools altogether. However, these are powerful resources that we should be able to leverage in our field while upholding the philological rigor that we need in our work. And this is, we should be able to take advantage of AI. And this is what my system, the current work that I'm doing, is trying to address. Now, to start from the beginning, and again, something that has happened to me for real research. Months ago, a colleague was working on a commentary on the Palatine ontology. She was looking for passages about bees. And the first step in such a research would be, as always, to go through one of the main databases of ancient texts and leverage what is known as keyword searches. Basically, typing words that would be in the passages that you're trying to retrieve. In this specific case, apis, bees. Now, let's look at what the database is producing as results. We have 144 results, passages of text. I believe it's arranged in alphabetical order, so the first 3 happen to be by Cicero. But if we look at each of them, the first place from Lucullus is about an analogy like apis, bees. Those are used as analogy for things too alike to tell apart. Apis apium or alvorum, so like much like eggs, bees are simillimai, are extremely similar. The second one from the De Finibus is about examples of cooperative animals. You have cranes, ciconiae, or other ants, other animals that collaborate with each other, that help each other. The third example actually talks about the omen, the prodigy of Parvulo Platoni, of like Plato as an infant, and the moment in which an apis, a bee, ended up on his lips, sort of foretelling the great intellectual achievement of the Greek philosopher. Now, I want to pause for a second looking at this, because all of these passages, actually the first 3 passages, contain the word bees, but they're not about the subject matter that we're searching, that we're trying to find information about. Now, a solution, a way to overcome this problem could be relying on similarity search. And this is a juxtaposition of a query that I ran using a RAG model. So asking this model, find ancient sources on bees. The first result is a passage from natural history, and that indeed at length talks about wax and flowers and all sorts of practices that the narrator observed when it comes to bees. However, if we look at the words that the author uses, we can have keras, wax, or mela in the 4th line. We have a very helpful passage that talks exactly about what we're looking at, that does not mention the word bees. So if you look at both examples, on the left-hand side, you would have a passage that contains the word, but or a number of passages actually, that do feature the word we're looking at, but they talk about something else. And now on the right-hand side, we are looking at a passage that does not mention the word bee, but instead does talk about the subject matter we are interested in. And I'm sure many of us have encountered the same problem. During my PhD, I worked extensively on elegiac poetry, and even though the entire genre is about love and those kind of encounters, you would rarely find the word eros or Venus, but nonetheless, the subject matter of the whole genre was pretty clear. Now, what do we mean by similarity search, and how does it work? The basic intuition is actually old, with J.R. Firth in the 50s, in his Synopsis of Linguistic Theory, formulated this compelling summary. you shall know a word by the company it keeps. So basically, in similarity search, we find text by what it means, not the word it uses. And we leverage computational method to do so. How do we turn a word into a number, however? How do we sort of like populate a vector space using words? Well, the process in the simplified example looks as such. You would basically count the occurrences of a given word in a context. So in this example, you have 4 sentences. If we look at, like we take a look at each word, like bees, for instance, we see that in the first sentence, it occurs with flower and hive. Bees gather nectar from flowers and make honey in the hive. And this can result matching the positive occurrences in a vector like this. The second word, honey, occurs with flower, once, twice with hive, and in no instances with soldier, enemy. This can be, again, turned into a vector, and so on with war and the other word at hand. Now, once you're able to turn a word into a vector, namely an element of an n-dimensional vector space, you can leverage vector algebra. You can calculate the distance, the semantic distance between words, or, when you generalize this process with machine learning and with entire passages, you have that each chunk of text becomes a point in a meaning space. So this is obviously a simplified 2-dimensional plotting of, in our case, for instance, our passage from the Naturalis Historia, or other texts regarding bees and texts about other topics. But like, how does the retrieval of these passages that populate as vector space work? Well, in a RAG system, so an AI system that helps us retrieve text using semantic similarity, the query itself, in our case, find passages about bees, will be plotted in this, will be, turned into a vector and be plotted in this vector space. And by calculating semantic similarity, now I want to sort of demystify like this process, because it's like technically it's called cosine similarity, which in a way sounds like this almost like spell that is incredibly complex. But we're looking at simply calculating the angle between these 2 dots, these 2 points in a meaning space. And the closer the angle is, the closer the meaning between the 2 passages is. So for instance, our query about bees happens to be extremely close to the passage of natural history concerning what bees forage on that we just looked at, whereas its cosine is like way larger when it comes to sort of like random documentary papyrus about the Fayum grain tax received. So this is sort of simplifying how we're able to turn passages into a point in meaning space and calculate semantic proximity as a sort of physical distance. Now, similarity search should therefore be a compelling way to retrieve passages, and in a way that there's something that would address the limitations of what we looked at with keyword search, for instance. However, I want to sort of bring out this other example. I was using a RAG system, and I queried it asking, find Greek poetry passages about honor, also another topic that I studied in my work, in my previous work. Now, if we look at the first passages that comes out, it's indeed something that mentioned quod est honestum, what is honorable. So it doesn't necessarily, it's no keyword match, although, honestus comes from honor, obviously, honus in Latin. It's absolutely on point, as it lists in the De Officis, in this philosophical work by Cicero, like what basically honor consists of and what are the ways to achieve honor. However, the RAG search was completely oblivious to my request for Greek poetry. A similarity search, a RAG search, cannot enforce Greek or poetry as constraints. What it does is captures usage and context, not the truth necessarily, and it has no internal logic. If I was to ask a RAG system, count me how many authors mention or talk about honor or bees or Egypt in their work, a RAG system would not be able to yield a satisfactory result. Now, one solution to match sort of the advantages of similarity search and being able to use constraints in our searches is what I call a knowledge graph. So querying a knowledge graph, and in this example, for instance, I asked the same questions: find Greek poetry passages on honor, and very aptly, the first result was from Iliad, from the 12th book of the Iliad, in which the achievement of non-honorable soldiers are listed. And if we look at if we break down how the query of a knowledge graph works in this example, that we see how Greek as a language and poetry as a genre were used as constraints, and then honor as a vector similarity concept was used to retrieve the very passage we were looking at. So in short, the graph disciplines vectors with categories that scholars already use. Now, once passages are represented as nodes, as elements of a graph connected to other nodes, we can ask questions that pure similarity search cannot handle, not to mention keyword search. Like, for instance, we could query this system asking, find Latin prose that attests beekeeping and not verse that alludes to them, due to that practice. Or find passages that mention a place in Attica. So again, like space first, and space as a constraint. Or for instance, which authors or how many authors, for instance, discuss the same place in both literary text and papyri. These are not just semantic questions. They combine meaning, the advantages of similarity search that we can leverage, with structure. That combination is what I mean here by GraphRAG. Now, to go back to this first section, we've seen the main methods that we use as a field and their hard failures. Large language models alone, like an AI model alone, tends to hallucinate, to produce answers that have false confidence, which in a way surreptitiously might persuade us to use those sources, but the black box and error-prone mechanism backfires, as we've seen in the first example. Keyword search, on the other hand, does not capture meaning. We might go through, as in the example, over 100 passages that mention bees, but don't talk about the very topic we're interested in. And then similarity search that finds semantics proximity, but cannot reliably enforce the constraints that we need as scholars. Now, the graph adds structure. We've seen in the examples language or genre. All these are constraints that we can use, and this is what I mean here in my work as GraphRAG. And now I want to show what this means and how we can leverage this form of retrieval in an actual system, in my prototype. Going to play this. So this is a prototype version. It did not contain all of the corpora that I'm currently building, but it's a sort of pretty self-evident way to look at, how the system works. In my query, what does Retrieval say about the Nile? We have, this output. This could be, like our regular LLM output that we see every day. I've added this feature in which like a user can rate the answer for my own data to improve the system. But most importantly, these sources are here. They are inspectable. And once we click on them, we sort of look at what the end result would be. So like we would have the passage, a translation. At this stage, I was embedding the context-oriented translation query that I will, want to credit my colleagues here. We'll have like name entity recognition, evidence type, and a number of other elements that I will discuss in the following. But this is sort of like the idea of the end result that I'm looking at, like an inspectable retrieval system for the ancient world. Now, in terms of corpora, again, what you just saw was a prototype that worked end-to-end. I am now working on extending the corpora that I've ingested as in terms of macro categories that I've included. We're looking at literary works, inscriptions, documentary papyri, and then like looking at the graph, at the knowledge graph. Places are referred to Pleiades and other like sort of the Karl Grosvenor computing place. So like a signature that provides more detail about a given ancient place. For ancient places, I've looked at Wikidata, and I've also developed a scholarly curated ecology vocabulary that I was able to map onto my passages. Now, I'm just going through each steps, all the steps that I took to build the system or for the system I'm currently building. I mentioned earlier the prototype. What compelled me to start over in a way was the extensive work on data pre-processing. So basically, with literary sources, I've looked at Perseus Digital Library, the first 1,000 year of Greek literature, when it comes to papyri, I've looked at the Duke Data Bank and the Heidelberg collection, and for epigraphy, I'm drawing from our very own University of Zurich EDCS. However, the issue has been that all of this data, in order to be turned in this operable, neat, small passages that a model can use, require a lot of effort. I'm sure like the kind of like just like think of noisy diacritic signs or interlinear commentaries. Like that first part of the system, of the first step really has taken most of my work. In a way, I'm also not unhappy about it because I want to know two things about my system. First of all, its architecture is additive by nature. So like say 2 months from now, I want to add another corpus, maybe of secondary scholarship or I don't know, archaeological data sets. I can do it because the pipeline allows it to sort of plug in additional data. I'm in no way married to the few corpora that I've used so far. And secondly, the data set is system agnostic. I'm sure that 6 to 12 months from now, some kind of cutting edge technology that I was recently I found online this YouTube video saying RAG is dead, which is something I don't know if that's entirely reliable, but I'm sure that by the time retrieval augmented generation or even GraphRAG will pass away, the data set will survive and the work done on this first step will survive. And I'm also more than happy to share it with our community. Another note, obviously, like each passage had to be linked to its unique identifier to make this interoperable and reusable. Now, in our Prosainis example, we'll see the second step of my process is to vectorize, these passages. I've embedded, for the vector embedding process, I've used Qwen3 with 8 billion parameters as an embedding model. It's a multilingual embedding model. I looked at the actual Greek and Latin, and the recall is sort of 80%, which is sort of like the basis to build from. But again, I can plug in, so the embedding process itself, I made sure the code is, again, model agnostic, so I can either think of fine-tuning that model or using the next shiny thing that will be produced to run the embedding on my system. Now, the third step, named entity recognition. As in this example, we can see that this very passage in Pausanias mentions a place, Pyrrhus, that I've extracted and linked to the Pleiades gazetteer, Silenus, this mythical figure that is said to have donated the well to the people of Pyrrhus. And finally, for my own scholarly curated ancient ecology vocabulary, I have hydraulic vocabulary of a frere, of well, in this case. Now, we can go into the specifics, but like for my Greek, I've used Ugarit as a model, and for my Latin sources, I've used Latin C with discrete results. Now, to get a better understanding or clearer sort of, to have an example of what ingesting the graph would look like within the system. So if we use Lake Morris as a place node, now we can see how literary sources and documentary papyri can attach themselves to the same node. So we have Herodotus, Strabo, and papyrological material all linking to this place in time, place in sort of like in the space. Now, this is probably more understandable by an example. Having the lake as a node, as a place node, allows us to ask questions such as which passages across literary texts and papyri refer to Lake Moeris, and how do they differ by source type or genre. So like having, instead of a list of strings, which would be just like chunks of text, but like having the backbone of a knowledge graph allows us to yield more sophisticated results when we query the system. Now, obviously, my prototype is sort of very focused on the spatial dimension of this data. As we see, we have obviously the place entity linked to the Pleiades gazetteer, but another sort of layer that I included is sort of the environmental signature from the Environmental Dimensions of Place by Karl Grosner, an amazing data set. And I am particularly attached to this example because, as we can see here, Pausanias is saying, in Pyrrhus, there is a well in the marketplace. People believe Silenus gave it to them, okay, but they would suffer for water if the well, the frere, ran dry. Now, if we look at this climactic signature, if there is a section about hydroclimactic that says groundwater limited. Now, these are additional information. The piece of evidence that we're looking at is obviously the ancient text is Pausanias, but it is indeed striking that data set is confirming what the ancient author is saying about, if they didn't have that well, they would be out of water in Pyrrhus because there's limited groundwater. So, and this is like one of the examples of, but like with the caveat that these are additional things, but like the starting point is the ancient text, of course. Now, spatial representation can also, help locate our nodes, our texts. So like places that are linked through the gazetteer, through Pleiades, can be mapped as coordinate. And in a way, a text or a papyrus or sort of a stone can be spatially explorable. And this could help like show where evidence clusters or overlaps. But again, this is not like a form of spatial, sort of like a geographical determinism. The map must lead back to the cited source. The map is just a way to take a different look at how the sources or other artifacts cluster. Now, this is something I'm particularly attached in the way I develop the system, and has to do with the evidence grading. Now, in this example, you have two texts that talk about the Nile. On the left, Herodotus is saying Egypt is for the Egyptian an acquired land, and Doron tu Potamu, a gift of the river. On the right-hand side, instead, you have a land declaration, a documentary papyrus, talking about sort of like how water ran dry in a specific plot of land, and sort of it's a record of the specific phenomenon that happened. Now, when we talk about evidence, a keyword search or an LLM answer would flatten these two as evidence, as the same thing. However, what we're looking at here are two passages, Herodotus saying that Egypt is a gift of the Nile, and this instead very specific documentary evidence that are doing two epistemological work that are different, but they're equally important. Herodotus is framing Egypt as a land-made as a river-made land, which is in itself something that contains information, whereas the other piece of evidence is a record, is a documentary record. We're not trying to say that one is wrong and one is right, but that we cannot flatten the two as a simple piece of evidence. In order to do so, I developed three working categories to sort of type the evidence in my system. The first being attestation. So simply something like a passage that directly reports a feature, a practice, or a condition. As in the example, there is a well in the marketplace. Fairly straightforward. The second category is inference, something like a text that supports a claim indirectly, something that the observer has inferred about a specific phenomenon. And then the third is called framing, something I define as framing. So Egypt is a gift of the river. So like a rhetorical, mythical, or moral use of language. And these have been interpreted and ingested in the graph as interpretation acts, as a node in itself that record the method in which this was done, its confidence. In the case of the well in the marketplace, we have 95%. And how it was generated in this case was machine generated using the specific model, GEMMA model, in a way that is inspectable by the people and the scholars looking at the evidence. Now, again, this passage is particularly dense even when it comes to the evidence layer, because here, this has been recorded as an attestation by the large language model with a pretty substantial degree of confidence. Now it's saying, there is a well in the marketplace. That's pretty straightforward. However, there is an instance of framing as well, because the same passage contains a reference to Silenus, gifting the well to the people of Pyrrhus. Now, this does not contradict sort of like the work that has been done, because like by having the evidence grading node as a node in the graph, we can always consider like an additive structure to it. We could have a second pass that has a different timestamp. We can look at, you know, a lower degree of confidence and have a scholar reviewing how the evidence grading has been conducted. In a way, it allows us it allows scholar to inspect the source in a way that yields like transparency and clarity, and that allows us to use these systems in a way that is helpful for our field. And this is, in a way, how each chunk, each sort of like piece of evidence would look like. It's findable, it's linked with other resources, it's placed, and it's graded in its type of evidence. This makes it a philologically controlled corpus, not like a text that has been spewed out by a machine, but something that can be held accountable in terms of how it's been annotated. Now, evaluation for this system. Obviously, each component has to undergo a different type of evaluation. When it comes to named entity recognition, I've used many of the sort of data sets available out there. In the specific case, Beasman article provides a data set of already annotated Pausanias, and my own named entity recognition had a sort of like 75% recall on the manually annotated work in Beasman's article. So a decent starting point. When it comes to retrieval and answer quality, I've used industry standard benchmarks. Well, for like this is my last pass. I this 80% recall on only on literary chunks from Perseus. What I've done, I've generated with an LLM question and answer pairs based on a specific chunk, and I've asked the same questions to my system, and I've seen the recall like in what is a percentage of instances in which the system is able to retrieve the very passage the question was about. More down the road for this later system, I would generate a question and answer evaluation set written by a scholar by hand. My institution has already allocated a number of hours, 60 particular, for the compensation of scholars who could annotate a question and answer set. And in terms of evidence labels, the same, like we'll see like two different scholars by hand sort of define grading the evidence type of a number of passages and see where they agree and where they disagree. Now, in terms of limitations and next steps, again, what you see, I mean, like, is the working prototype that I showed at the beginning. There's 300,000 passages. The graph search is operational. The spatial and evidence layers are linked out. For now, the annotation has been only conducted by a machine, but as I said, resources have been already allocated by my institution, and I count on having a published data set on Zenodo by this fall. Also, in the next months, I am planning on launching it as a web interface with all the corpora listed, so literary text, papyri, and inscriptions, map-based exploration feature, and I'm also considering fine-tuning both the embedding model and the model running the sort of cipher, the queries to the graph, sort of the model that turns natural language question by the user into queries that are meant for the graph. And obviously also like scholarly review and correction. I'm particularly interested in launching the system to gather user feedback, both for internal circulation within my institution, but also for the wider community. I think that those would be fundamental to sort of address the next directions of my system. I want to conclude with a quote by Charlotte Schuber in her seminal work on purpose benefit of text mining. Applying Franco Moretti's juxtaposition of close reading, classical text analysis, and distant reading, text analysis with digital humanities methods, the situation of close reading can be described as that of walkers in the forest versus those, the distant reading, flying in an airplane over the forest. The walker in the forest can walk several paths through the forest and can also explore different interests and describe in great detail. The one who sees the forest from the plane can see from a bird's eye view the entire forest and its surroundings. This is the view from above. Today, with algorithm-based analysis, we have new possibilities for exploration. But the fear of a tabula rasa interpretation that reads text algorithmically and produces a false objectivity is not entirely unfounded and has to be taken into account. In short, Talus graph, or any GraphRAG system, can turn ancient passages into inspectable evidence objects. They are semantically searchable, spatially grounded, and source critically annotated. Thank you, and I look forward to your inputs and to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Very useful introduction to the project in particular, and also extremely useful to me, at least, introduction to some of the concepts and defining what a RAG was and that sort of thing, which can't be taken for granted. I was very pleased with that. So yes, thank you. Any questions immediately in the room? There was, if people need a moment to digest that. People online, please feel free to post questions in the live chat. Other people in the StreamYard room online also feel free to raise your hands and say if you want to ask anything. People in the physical room also feel free to ask questions. There is one question that was asked quite early on when you first introduced your project, and I suspect you may have at least partly answered this, although you, as far as I can tell, so Andrea Lavendet, I have no idea if I'm separating that name correctly, or indeed if it's a name, said compliments on the work, and how did you evaluate the retrieval? You partly answered that, but you largely answered that in the future tense. So I wondered if you had anything more you wanted to add about that.
Yes, absolutely. So like what I reported here is basically a simple recall on this data set that was question and answer pairs that were generated. For the prototype, I've drawn from the industry standards, so like RAGAS as a framework for RAG evaluation, and also deep eval. So those are what I would like, the tools that appear to be in scholarship, the industry standards that I relied upon. Again, a significant step forward will happen when I'm able to put together the ground truth, this data set actually produced by scholars. And like a third way, I'm almost like looking at addressing the problem in this kind of like different angles, because I think that once I have enough users and I'm able to gather data about how they interact with the tools, I will be more able to look at how they themselves have rated the output of the system, and that could be like a third channel that I can use. So like from simple recall to the industry standards that I will use to evaluate based on handwritten, scholarly made data set to the actual response and feedback from the users, both for a small, like a more limited circulation within my institution, but also for the public at large. I think that these three different angles could yield interesting results.
Yeah, I have a related question. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Partly because I'm kind of from philosophy part, that's why I'm thinking that evaluation is quite difficult because there is no specific one single answer for the question. Because, for example, if you ask how Plato describes or criticizes democracy or something like that, of course there are many answers possible, right? And then that's why you're saying that you're asking scholars to produce golden kind of some answers and so on. Then, of course, I mean the difficult part might be that there's no kind of single kind of answer to test against. That's why. So I mean, I think there are many such cases in classical texts. So of course, as you mentioned, kind of data aware and this kind of example, it's quite easy whether that is correct or not. But there are many other questions. And yeah, what do you think?
Oh no, well, you're absolutely right. This is it's important to be aware of the limitations when it comes to even like evaluating like a RAG system. But in a way, to go back from to sort of this idea of a RAG system being a sort of bird's eye view of an entire corpus. Like what I'm particularly interested in is that is the system being able to retrieve that specific line of text that I'm looking at? Or even if you look at a graph standpoint, is the system able to count the occurrences of a specific, very deterministic sort of phenomenon, like how many authors talked about, I don't know, Plato or something, or Julius Caesar? And when it comes to a more qualitative analysis, and then sort of like a more refined interpretation of the text, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I could have two answers. One would be, well, if the users find it compelling, then that could be data, but obviously I would need a lot of user input for that. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily too concerned with the idea that my system should be able to interpret ancient text. If it's able to retrieve information as my starting point as a philologist to investigate further, I would find it successful. But ideally, yeah, this is sort of like the way I look at it. If the scholarship can find ways to make it think and make it work a little bit more, it's like sort of like in a qualitative way and interpret text, that would be also extremely interesting as sort of like a philological double. But for now, if the system is able to retrieve passages better than semantic search, that would be to me a great success.
Can I just add one little thing?
Please.
I've asked several times some of my colleagues to evaluate our system, our RAG system, because we are also producing RAG system as well. So at that time, we found that many people say that, for example, if the system says, okay, this can be found on Plato's Republic, Book 8. Oh, I know this passage, of course. So I don't need that, but I want more diverse perspectives and angles and so on. So what I want is more, the text I didn't know. So in humanities, so that kind of evaluation is quite difficult because depends on users and specialty and so on. They have different needs, so that's why, yeah. So for those kind of specialists, so they need more diverse text. But of course, for people who are not specialists, they need direct, more direct text. So that's why somehow evaluation is quite difficult, I thought. Yeah.
Oh no, yeah, no, I agree with you. When it comes to interpretation, obviously most of the work we do, I mean, we will hardly find, oh, a new, maybe the case of these was very specific, but when it comes to, famous authors and the texts that are at the forefront of our field, we all know where the passages passages are, especially for when it comes to more advanced scholars. However, it's all about what kind of use case you're looking at. There's this tendency, something that I bring up when I talk about my system. The key to robust digital humanities, as opposed to experimenting with new technologies, is to have a use case in mind. So was the system able to take me from A to B? And the use case that I've thought about when I developed the system was, for instance, the development of commentaries. And there's sort of so many commentaries about, I mean, I know directly sort of scholars at work in my university, and I've met them at conferences, etc., that work with understudied authors, and for them, being able to retrieve passages about a very specific sort of little thing that is obscure and is different than sort of like what does Aristotle means by virtue, right? So like for such a use case, a system like this, I think, could yield promising results. And by the way, I'm glad to have this exchange with people working with the Humanitext Antigua, because like the example of these comes from the system you built, and literally I had like a direct use case of a colleague sitting in my office, like the desk next to mine. They were looking for a passage that they were not able to retrieve using keyword search. So that to me is a success story. Will we be able to use it to interpret very prominent philosophy works? Maybe. I would love that, but that's further down the road from my perspective.
So I was moving closer to the screen, so there's a small question. There's a 5-part question.
Oh my.
Martin Steer of Science, which I haven't read yet. I think I read the first 3 parts of the question. He says that the evidence grading aspects are extremely powerful. He's been wondering, which you partly explained with graph data, how does the cosine similarity metric find specific types of similarity in the source information? For example, the Greek bee metaphors, or literal bee mentions in Arabic, or skull-shaped wax bee candles. Is it just a matter of articulating the specific evidence you're seeking in the natural language query? Does the GraphRAG model have to explicitly model the kinds of relationships? So he has a sub-question, which may be very quick to answer, which is which embedded model are you using?
Well, thank you for this amazing question, really. So a few things. In terms of the model, the embedding model I used, it's Qwen3 8 billion parameter. If like I've compared it with fine-tuned Spilberta, like fine-tuned models specific to ancient texts, and so far it's the one that has yielded the best results. So if you find anything that's better, like please send me an email. To your question, so it's basically the pipeline to find that to sort of like to write those annotation is, well, this is sort of something loosely related that I want to go to in a second. But the idea is simply that you have either a human being or a large language model read each passage, and and ask what type of evidence does this passage contain. If obviously the passage could be about something else, so like it doesn't mean that each chunk of text contain evidence or contain evidence of a specific kind. But the way it's been done is, again, using semantic similarity, or basically not even just like semantic similarity for the large language model to interpret the passage, and then using it to output a type of annotation. Now, in terms of how can this be done, because you talked about word correspondence, etc. I think this example with the ecology vocabulary that I developed could be a little bit helpful. So I started from the most reputable basically text about water infrastructure in the Nile region. This is basically a case study I conducted on a subset just to make sure, I could build ecology vocabulary in a way that was compelling and helpful. So I started from the basic control vocabulary that was put together by Daniel Bonneau. And then there are 3 ways to annotate, if say the term well or aqueduct is present. So when so again, the large language model will look at a passage. If the ancient term is present and it's unambiguous, let's say it's a very specific piece of machinery that is no polysemic in nature, then you get this is annotated as sort of a well or whatever this word could be, with a high level of trust. Now, when it comes to words with polysemous terms, I can say, the well of my heart is full of love. I could use obviously sort of ecology related term without meaning that in the literal sort of semantic nuance of, there's a well in the marketplace, right? In that case, the large language model would issue sort of would annotate it, but with a different trust level. And then there's a third instance in which, much as the case with bees, the text is clearly referring to, say, a well or an aqueduct or something else that has to do with this control vocabulary, but it's not using the very word. So in that case, it's still annotated. So if a passage says the greater infrastructure that Claudius built that allowed water to be brought to the city of Rome, they're always talking about the aqueduct of Claudius, but the word's not there. And in that case, the LLM would annotate the instance of that word with sort of with a lower degree of confidence and require a human validation. There's sort of so this kind of more concrete examples with ecology vocabulary, perhaps sort of provided more details to answer that question, but feel free to follow up. And thank you for a very compelling observation and question.
So I will come to you in a second. There is a question that was inadvertently posted to the private chat rather than to the chats by Elizabeth, so I thought I'm copying it into the chat. I don't know if you want to put it on screen or if you'd like to ask it yourself, Elizabeth. You can unmute.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Federico. Thank you very much. That was very interesting and extremely thought-provoking. I was just curious, could you quantify the split between Latin and Greek texts that you have used? Is it 50-50 or is it slightly more towards one or the other side?
It's, as of now, it's, I would say 60-40. We all know there's that whole subgenre of, ways to build cranes, also the technical essays that there are sort of that the Greek language has produced. So it's slightly tilted towards the Greek corpora. But yeah, so that's my experience so far. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And then I have a bunch of questions actually, 3 or 4.
Fire away.
Two questions. So the first one is very simple.
Mm-hmm.
So you do name entity recognition and you evaluated it. The result was 0.75, right?
Yes,
75%.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
which model you use for this name entity recognition? It's a very simple one. And there is, I think you have a link to the Pleiades space references, and then there is a different task. The named entity recognition and the entity linking is a different task. So how much is the kind of precision or the before the F1 values for entity linking task? So that's my first question.
Yeah, so in order, like for Greek texts, I use Ugarit, sort of like basically a model that was fine-tuned for a specific task. I use latency for Latin texts. I'm planning on using, in terms of evaluation, just data. So I have only evaluated the Greek side of things, and it was recall. So like the recall was 75%. In terms of surfacing those matches and then linking them to the Pleiades gazetteer. The pipeline, I started with a pipeline that I thought was incredibly brilliant, and then it didn't work, which was basically for each passage, you would use a model to surface, say, Athens or Pyrrhus, but then also use a deterministic way to find matches based on all the place names from the gazetteers, both the place names and the author. That's sort of like name, that's sort of like people names, right, or ethnonyms. And the idea was, if the model finds, say, a mention of Athens, and also the keyword search find a correspondence between Athens and obviously like the entry on Wikidata or on Pleiades about Athens, then that's a match. Great. If it's only one, so it's either only the model or only the keyword match, an LLM would disambiguate that. And this is sort of like what I had in mind. What happened was that there are like a very high number of places that are called something like the forest or the port or Stratos. And so the sort of keyword match, it would constantly surface those.
And also there are a bunch of cities.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is something I haven't, so the 75% is from the prototype. This is kind of like the workaround and the architectural choice that I made later on, which was, okay, a model is surfacing the name entity recognition, another model is matching them with the gazetteers, and then if there is a certain threshold of confidence, yet a third model disambiguates them. But something that has happened to me with Ugarit and latency is that maybe there is a little bit of, it's not very accurate when it comes to, maybe it would mix up ethnonyms and then a place, right? So this is something that requires a further, so I've seen better results when you have a disambiguation with the label of the given place.
You know about the Margarita, Margarita in Leuven University?
Yeah.
A lot of models for entity recognition in Latin, I think. The function model, so maybe you can try doing that.
I'm not, I've recently looked at a very brilliant work. Now I'm blanking on, it could be, Antoli her last? Yeah. So that, that's something, but like another student, I think a PhD student at Leuven has done something about using topos text as, and sort of like starting from, I'm not sure if that's Fantoli's or maybe that's someone else's.
It's her PhD student.
Correct, yeah.
Participating in the conference yesterday.
Oh, okay. I looked at her work. It was impressive. But the thing is, like, my understanding is one way to address this ambiguity could be starting from the established English or modern language translation. And I think this is a very persuasive sort of architectural choice. In my case, because, say, when it comes to epigraphy, either most of the data has not been translated, or like a machine translation is really wanting when it comes to, so in my experience, if like models that do a pretty good job with prose or literary text really fail when it comes to all the acronyms that are and abbreviations that are used in certain genre and in epigraphic data. So with that, I fully espouse the sort of idea of like starting with a translation. In my specific use case, that's not possible for now, at least. So I'm basically okay with that 75 recall.
Question?
Yes, I think so. There's also a follow-up question from this question. So okay, maybe we could alternate. This may also be a quick question. So Marty asks that if you're encoding the semantics into the graph data, why do you need LLMs to query it then? Spark will do the same.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by encoding the semantics into the graph data. So like the way the graph, so like the way you can use a graph search, so like a query on a graph, on a knowledge graph using SparkQL. In my case, I'm the infrastructure I'm using is Neo4j. So the query language would be Cypher. It's called Cypher. What I do is that when the user asks a question, the question gets sort of vectorized, and so you get all the RAG answers basically. And then the question is turned into a Cypher query or a SparkQL query, and which would surface maybe a different set of passages that are relevant to the query that's been asked, and then a re-ranker would combine them. So that's one way to go. Another approach I experimented or played with was using the graph as constraints. So if I ask, okay, I want to know about these, but it has to be from prose author in the, I don't know, 2nd century, then the Cypher or SparkQL queries would yield like a subset that corresponds to the constraints that I've given, and then I would run semantic search in that subset. That way, I won't have Cicero being used when I ask about Greek poetry on honor and shame. But like, if I didn't feel free to follow up if I did not understand your specific question.
I think that does it. So it's the combination of the different approaches that allow you to drill that. Or what to say?
Yeah. Okay. So my second question is about editions.
Yeah.
So probably for the literary text, you use the Pasqua's digital library.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not really sure which text you're based on, but probably the public, open source, open, data.
Oh yeah. So when it comes to literary text, I use Perseus and first 1,000 Euro Greek. Which is same as Humanitext.
Yeah, it's also using Perseus, but the problem is of course edition. So Perseus, the edition used in Perseus quite old. For some texts, there are newer editions, and then this problem is even more important, I think, than the epigraphy.
Right.
Epigraphy, there are a bunch of editions, and then the reading will be significantly differ between editions.
Right.
And your system is focusing on kind of concepts, so which is quite granular, and it, for example, like single word or even the single characters can affect the results of your system outputs, right? In that case, the difference between editions is quite, significant, and how you can just deal with this. Of course, there are copyright problems there, so how you can kind of deal with it to improve your system as much as possible.
Yeah, so thank you for your question. This is something that I spent weeks on, and at ingestion level. So like this would be like step one. When it comes to literary sources, my conservative approach has been, because like there were like the actual, not as much with epigraphy, because like like if I'm only relying on EDCS, I would take the latest version, and so that's curated by scholars in.
The interesting thing, we visited Oxford several days ago on Monday and talked to Jonathan Craig, who is director of the digital project. And he said data in EDCS is really problematic. So yeah, the EDCS is the coverage is quite good, but the data quality is a bit problematic. So yeah, of course trade-off between them.
Yeah, but like, I guess that it's a go-to. So like, unlike with literary texts, you have a lot of instances when you compare Perseus with the first 1,000 years of Greek, when you have editions that, unless I'm a scholar in this obscure Neo-Latin or like obscure sort of late antique author, I wouldn't know which is better. So my conservative approach in that instance, when it comes to literary text, has been, okay, I'm going to sort of run a deterministic assessment and look at what text is less noisy. Because like even prior to looking at the quality of edition from a sort of logical choice point of view, we are looking at texts that in many cases have been OCR'd. So you have like characters that make no sense. You have, so like my sort of low conservative priority has been data integrity, even before philological purity. Because like I personally, this is something that you can achieve deterministically, and then you can scale out to 2,000 works mentioned in the combined two data sets. I cannot scale out, or I mean, at least that I can think of, like which, because I agree with the idea. Okay, a more recent edition is better, but like I don't want to get all philological for like thinking what is like anteriores, not deteriores. Like we don't like, it's not necessarily when you have an older text, it's like a worse text. It's so so like it would be interesting to answering your question. The choices between, at a first glance, equally valid editions between Perseus and first 1,000 years of Greek has been about data integrity and a sort of noisy text deterministic check that I could run in seconds. When it, like my choice with epigraphy was to go to the most established, the one sort of that has the widest coverage, as you rightly said. I'm not sure I could. I mean, I'm not going to be able to look at every edition of Plato and all the others and say, okay, this was actually better. I am a little bit skeptical of, like, again, the older ones being worse than the new ones, but it's defensible. So maybe like a workaround could be, okay, only select, when it comes to two editions of the same text, only select the ones that is the most recent, assuming the metadata on that scale even have that information. Yeah, so that's the correct architecture choice that I made, but like I'm happy to have more inputs on that. Thank you.
Any other?
If not that. Yeah, I wanted to hear more about how you are kind of planning, or you are already planning or producing graph data. So are you using the same chunking system for RAG, or maybe you're using a different, for example, sentences or words? How do you connect one data to another? And also, so is your graph data based on some concept or some entity, or for example, bees, then there are texts which refer to bees, and then you're connecting the different texts, focusing on bees. I mean, what is it? Do you, making connections in between or chunk?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I have some extra notes about sort of like the like a core idea for my graph. I think so. In terms of like for my chunks, just for in order not to duplicate the entire data set, I just kept the same length for for the RAG and the graph chunks. In terms of the schema and the node types, like this kind of like basis that I'm building from is this very simple sort of like I have a corpus type of node, a work, passage, so chunk, person, place, and time, and then the evidence type being something. And this again, sort of as you know, ingesting a much like vectorization, really, like these processes take almost no time. What takes an incredible amount of time is data preprocessing. So as of now, and especially like once I have the sort of scholarly curated evaluation data set, I think that this sort of fairly simple, very basic schema for my graph and sort of like it can work. But like the way I'm going to implement a different direction is going to be driven by the result and the responses from users. Because like if I really notice a pattern in the kind of queries that I get that are about that, I don't know, emphasize different aspects rather than, I want to know about prose and language. Maybe scholars don't super care about like the kind of like the medium and the language. Maybe sort of what drives discovery is something that I haven't taken into account so far. So like as of now, I've taken a fairly simple sort of basic sort of schema for my graph. The one thing I was very concerned with was the evidence type, because it's working with a number of archaeologists. That's the objection that you get all the time. So like, yeah, exactly, because they don't want different types of evidence to be flattened. And that was, a very helpful input that maybe as a philologist I wouldn't have understood or I wouldn't have come up with. So this is right now what I've been choosing. Once I have more information, once I have sort of like more quantitative evidence in terms of the feedback of users, I'm happy to change to re-ingest my nodes in the graph, because that takes no time. Of course.
So maybe those of us who are here can ask the many more questions that we know to have Federico in the pub over a drink, where they also have air conditioning, unlike this room. Those, if any other questions go to anybody online, just get in touch directly from there. So we can thank Federico again for this very stimulating discussion. And just a last reminder to people on YouTube, please join us for the next of these seminars in 2 weeks' time, when Michele Cotti from the University of Siena will be talking about multimedial edition of Hero Alexandrinus Pneumatica. We'll also be here in person and live on YouTube. So hope to see many of you there. Cheers.